So let's think about what happens when someone in our household is sick, right? So first of all, we put all of our effort towards the person who's sick, right? We want to make them better. We want to give them support. Maybe we have to go and get things at the store for them and bring them back home, some medicine to help them get better. But in addition to that, it also kind of disturbs our whole balance that we have, right, in the household. So if it's a child that's sick, that means a parent might have to stay home and change their schedule. Or if it's a parent that's sick, then the other parent's going to have to change their schedule to allow and make up the difference for the person that's sick in the household. So the brain and spinal cord are like this. So when one of the cells in the brain and spinal cord is infected or injured or is under stress, they also are a household. And the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. And they function together, and they have walls like our house has. So our house has walls. We don't let people in from the outside. And this is the same with the brain and spinal cord. They are separated from the rest of the body by the blood-brain barrier. And this barrier then restricts what can come in and out of the brain and spinal cord, because the functions that the brain and spinal cord do are absolutely critical, right? We wouldn't survive without them functioning properly. And so this highly regulated system has been developed to protect the brain and spinal cord. So the blood-brain barrier is actually a tight junction of endothelial cells that regulates and decides who can come in and who can't come in. Very much like our house, we have a door to our house, and it decides who we're going to let in, who we're going to invite in, and who we keep on the outside. So who are the members in the CNS household? Well, first and foremost, we have the neurons, right? They are the most important cell. They control the functioning, the movement, our feelings. Everything in our body is controlled through the neurons. So they are the most important and critical cells. And so the other cells in the CNS are kind of the support to make sure the neurons can do their functions properly. So the largest group of cells are the glia cells. And of those is the oligodendrocytes. And these cells have myelin. And this myelin goes and it wraps around the neurons. And it insulates neurons so that the neurons can send their signals very evenly, because neurons are very, very long. And so it allows them to send their signals across long distances. Then there are the astrocytes. And the astrocytes are the most abundant cell type. They make this really dense network in which the CNS environment exists. And they secrete factors that, again, support the neurons in their normal functions. And finally, we have the microglia. So microglia are the immune cells of the central nervous system. So they are often called macrophage type cells, and that is true, and that their original origin is myeloid. But they very, very early in development of the CNS, they come from the yolk sac, so this is extremely early in development, and they go to the developing brain and spinal cord, and they play a critical role in development. So they phagocytose tissue, and they help form synapses between the neurons. So once development is done and you have a developed brain and spinal cord, they just stay there as residents. And they exist there for the lifetime, and they just repopulate themselves within the CNS. So microglia are these really unique innate immune cells. They have a very unique function in that they can recognize things that are not self. So they can recognize pathogens like viruses and bacteria. They can also recognize damaged tissue, so tissue that's not normal. And they recognize this through innate immune receptors that are on their cell surface. And when these innate immune receptors recognize that there's something not right, they initiate an immune response by the microglia. And then the microglia will secrete immune factors and mediate the development of the immune response in the central nervous system. So what's really interesting and unique is that microglia express every innate immune receptor that has been identified. And this is not like other immune cell types. They will only express certain subsets. So microglia are finely tuned to respond to anything because they're the only immune cells in the CNS, right? So they have to protect and be able to detect whatever happens in the CNS. And this is what they do. They are constantly moving. They have little projections, and they constantly are moving around and checking out the CNS environment. They go over the neurons and make sure everything is all right. But again, if they sense that something is wrong through these innate immune receptors, then they respond. So imagine a virus infection, right? So the microglia will sense that there is a virus that has come and broken through the blood-brain barrier. They recognize the virus through these innate immune receptors. And then the microglia become activated, and they secrete cytokines, chemokines, and effector molecules. So the cytokines can actually be antimicrobial. So they can inhibit the virus replication and control the pathogen that has entered. The cytokines also activate the other microglia and astrocytes around them to respond, letting them know there's an infection, we need help. Then they secrete chemokines that bring cells into the site of infection to initiate this immune response so that they can get rid of the pathogen. Now, if the CNS cannot control it themselves, so the microglia cannot control this infection, then they send out these cytokines that will open up that blood-brain barrier, the tight junction, and they send out chemokines, and then they allow cells from the blood to come in and help fight the infection. And these peripheral immune cells include your T cells and your B cells and other macrophage. And then they come in, and together, the local inflammatory response by the microglia and these infiltrating cells will clear the virus infection, right? And everybody gets better. This is great, right? So the inflammatory response that is initiated by microglia when they're activated is called neuroinflammation. And in the scenario I just talked about, it's good, right? So you've cleared the virus infection, and everybody's healthy. The CNS can continue doing its functions as it is supposed to. But sometimes this neuroinflammation stays too long. And this is associated with neurological diseases, such as multiple sclerosis and chronic pain, and dementia has also been included in this group, as well as other neurological diseases. So let's explore this a little bit more. So we're talking about multiple sclerosis. So that virus infection that we had, if the inflammatory response by the microglia stays too long or is too strong, it can actually release factors that cause damage to other CNS cells, namely the oligodendrocytes. So when oligodendrocytes become exposed to these inflammatory markers, they will actually lose myelin expression. And so now your neurons lose that insulation. The myelin wrapped around those neurons doesn't have that insulation anymore. And so the signals can't transmit as well. And so that's when you start to have neurological problems, right? You start to have little tics and things like that. So once the neurons are demyelinated, though, then the neurons can become targets to these factors that are being secreted. And then you have damage to the neurons and even loss of neurons. And then you have complete loss of a function, right? So that's where you have loss of neurological function, and you develop paralysis. And so that's what happens in multiple sclerosis. So microglia play a critical role in this progressive neuroinflammation that occurs during progression of multiple sclerosis. So let's talk about another scenario. How about chronic pain? So pain is something that's normal. So something around your body, you either have an injury or you have a disease, and you feel pain. So in this diagram I'm showing you, there's something happens to your foot. You have an injury to your foot. But let's talk about something more relevant to us in the dental school, and we'll talk about temporal mandibular joint disease. So people with TMD will have pain, and it's mainly in the jaw or the muscles, the masseter muscles, and they have this pain. And the reason they have that is that there are nerve endings in the tissue, and those will recognize when there's injury or disease, they will recognize signals, and that's how you elicit pain. So from the nerve endings then, the signal goes to the trigeminal ganglia, which is in, for the facial. In the diagram that's shown behind me, it's actually showing from the foot, it goes to your dorsal root ganglia. So it basically goes to the ganglia, and you're having this pain response, okay? So this is all normal. Now, if this pain response gets too strong or too long, the neurons from the ganglia actually terminate in the central nervous system. When we're talking about TMD and orofacial, we're talking about those neurons actually terminate in the trigeminal brainstem. And the microglia and the neurons, remember, they are close together. Okay, so these cells are like touching each other. And so microglia and neurons have a normal communication, right? So that in that normal state, microglia secrete growth factors and survival factors that help the neurons function. So that's normal state. But now, if those neurons are excited because of the pains that the signal that they received, they become excitatory. And then they release factors because they're under stress. And these factors can include ATP or neuropeptides. And the innate immune receptors that are on the microglia recognize these as stress signals, danger signals. And so they feel like they have to respond. So now the microglia become activated, and they start secreting factors, those immune factors. And the immune factors can then, in turn, bind to receptors on the neurons. And when they bind those factors that are being secreted by microglia, it actually enhances that excitatory state of the neurons. And now you have intense pain and continual pain. And it makes this feedback loop between the neurons and the microglia. They keep each other activated, right? The neurons activate the microglia keep the neurons activated, and now you've created this big feedback loop between the two. And this is sometimes referred to as centralized pain. So when the pain goes into your central nervous system, and the pain that originated it out in the periphery, whether it was your foot or TMD, that might have subsided, whatever that initial injury or insult was. That could have subsided, but now you've created this loop that can't be turned off that's between the microglia and the neurons. So my research focuses on this interaction, right? So my research focuses on how can we work to control the inflammatory response by microglia in these different neurological diseases. So what we're trying to figure out is how do microglia become activated? How do they stay activated for so long? And most importantly, how can we turn them off? Right? So we do a lot of work. I work with some pharmaceutical chemists where we're developing new compounds that can reduce the inflammatory response by microglia. I also use microRNAs and naturally produced proteins that also can turn off that inflammatory response by microglia. So we're talking about multiple sclerosis. We really want to turn down the inflammatory response by microglia, and we also want to promote an anti-inflammatory response and repair mechanisms within the microglia. So that's what we're focusing on when we're working in multiple sclerosis. We want to convert those microglia from that inflammatory state into more of a reparative and controlling the general inflammatory response, which happens from infiltrating cells. Now, when we're talking about chronic pain, what we really want to do is we want to interrupt this pathway that I was just talking about between the neurons and the microglia. So opioids are very effective in treating pain, and they target the neurons. But unfortunately, there's side effects to those. So what we're trying to do is come in from the microglia. So can we turn off the microglia so that they don't contribute to that feedback loop? So if the neurons don't continue to get those activation signals, will they eventually calm down? And then the pain would subside. So that's what we're working on. And we really spent a lot of time working on the molecular mechanisms by which these pathways are activated. So we're looking at receptors, signaling pathways, and trying to identify specifically which proteins and molecules are involved in that so we can develop more targeted therapies. So we want to specifically turn off the bad parts of neuroinflammation, but keep the good parts of neuroinflammation. So neuroinflammation is good, as I described. It's very important to protect from infection. It's very important after injury to help repair the tissue. So neuroinflammation is very good, and it was designed, again, to protect the CNS, right? Protect our house, right? We want to protect. And it works really well in most cases. But sometimes it goes a little bad, right? So you have too much neuroinflammation, or it lasts too long, and then you can fall into those diseases like chronic pain and multiple sclerosis. And so just like our household, when someone is sick, we want to make them better. And when they get better, we should all return back to normal, right? The way we were. And that's what we're trying to do here. We just want to take the CNS and return it back to that normal state where it was, so that everybody's healthy and everybody's happy.